What the Vikings did to the 42 nuns was worse than you can imagine, hidden for 1,000 years. In the year 793, the monastery of Lindisfarne in Northumbria was washed in blood. That much is certain. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded it with stark horror. Heathen men came and miserably destroyed God's church by rapine and slaughter. But what happened to the nuns? Almost nothing in the mainstream histories. Not because it didn't happen, but because medieval chroniclers, mostly monks themselves, often refused to write down the worst of it. Some details were considered too shameful for Christian readers. Other records were deliberately destroyed or rewritten. For over 1,000 years, a specific story has lingered only in local legends, fragmented Icelandic sagas, and one damaged Latin manuscript kept in a German archive. The story of 42 nuns taken from a small, unknown convent on the east coast of England, not Lindisfarne, but a place called St. Eby's Coldingham, in the year 870. What the Vikings did to those 42 women was so terrible that even the monastery's own chronicler, a nun named Aelflaed, wrote only, "Let what came after be unspoken among Christians, for the tongue cannot form it nor the ear bear it without sin." Then she stopped writing entirely. Her last entry is dated October 14, 870. The next surviving record appears 200 years later, in a Danish saga written by a Christian priest trying to make sense of his pagan ancestors. He calls it the silence of the veiled ones. This is what the silence hid. The convent that should not have been there. Coldingham Priory stood on a windswept headland overlooking the North Sea. It was a double monastery, men and women, separate but under one abbess. By 870, it had existed for over 170 years. The abbess was named Egelwina, elderly and half-blind, but fierce. The nuns numbered exactly 42. That number is not symbolic. It comes from a surviving property list, 42 women, ranging in age from 14 to 70. They lived in stone cells, prayed the divine office 8 times a day, and tended a small flock of sheep. They were poor. They were peaceful. And they were, by 870, living in a world that had already burned around them. For 3 generations, Viking fleets had ravaged the English coast. Monasteries were targeted not because of anti-Christian hatred, though that grew over time, but because they stored portable wealth, silver chalices, jeweled book covers, gold altar crosses. But by 870, the easy plunder was gone. The great monasteries like Jarrow and Wearmouth had been looted and abandoned. So why did Coldingham survive so long? Because it was poor. No chronicler thought it worth mentioning. No Viking scout marked it on a mental map. For 170 years, the wind and the sheep and the waves protected the 42 nuns. Then, in late September 870, a storm drove a longship off course. Or so the legend says. More likely, a Danish chieftain named Halfdan had heard rumors of an old burial mound near the convent, pagan gold buried with a king from before the coming of Christ. He landed 80 men on the beach below the cliffs. They found no gold in the mound. But they found the convent. What the nuns did first. The nuns saw the ships before the Vikings reached the gate. The youngest ran to the church, pulling the heavy oak door shut. The eldest gathered the consecrated hosts from the altar and swallowed them, so the Eucharist would not be defiled. Abbess Egelwina sent 2 novices, aged 14 and 15, down a hidden path to the nearest village to warn others. That act saved no one in the convent but preserved the story. One of those novices, a girl named Leofrun, later gave testimony to a bishop. Her account was written down in a now-lost document, but fragments survive in a 12th century chronicle from Durham. Leofrun described watching from a cliff half a mile away as the Vikings broke down the gate. She saw the nuns led out in a line. Then she ran, and did not look back. For 1,100 years, that was almost all that was known. The missing pages. In 1875, a German historian named Karl Morch was cataloguing manuscripts in the library of Fulda. He found a codex labeled Vita Sancti Egelwini, the life of Saint Egelwina. But the last 6 pages had been cut out. Only stubs remained. On one stub, in tiny, nearly illegible 10th century handwriting, were the words, Et postea Dani fecerunt quod nec in paginis nec in cordibus scribae potest. And afterward the Danes did what can be written neither on pages nor in hearts. Morch searched for the missing pages for 30 years. He never found them. But in 1922, a young British scholar named Marjorie Shibnall, working in the Vatican archives, discovered a letter from 1095. It was written by a Norman abbot to Pope Urban II, asking for guidance. The abbot had found, in the ruins of Coldingham, a wooden box buried under the floor of what had once been the nuns' dormitory. Inside were 42 small lead crosses, each inscribed with a woman's name, and a single sheet of vellum in Old English. The sheet was badly damaged. But Shibnall transcribed what she could. In the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, I, Aelflaed, servant of Christ and sister to these 42, write what I saw before I was taken. They did not kill us at once. That was their cruelty. They made us choose. The letter ended there. The rest of the vellum was rotted away. The choice. What choice? No other medieval source gives the full answer. But folk memory preserved in Danish ballads from the island of Funen, collected in 1821 by Niels Mathias Petersen, tells a consistent story. The ballads describe a raid on a nunnery of white-veiled women where the Vikings gave the nuns a choice: renounce your god and marry one of us, or be given to the crew in the way of the old custom. The old custom is never described. But similar phrases appear in Icelandic law codes Gragas regarding female captives of certain types. The implication is ritualized gang rape, sometimes over days, sometimes in public, sometimes with objects. The goal was not just sexual violence but spiritual humiliation, to break the nun's vow of chastity by force, thereby damning her soul in her own belief system. A 13th century Norwegian homily book warns Christians, if a heathen forces you to lie with him, you are not guilty of the sin, but you must never afterward marry a Christian man, for you are made unclean in the eyes of the law. That single sentence tells us everything. The Vikings knew exactly what they were doing. They were not just raping women. They were weaponizing theology. The 42 names. Here is the most haunting detail. In 1986, during an archaeological dig at Coldingham, a lead cross was found, exactly as the 1095 letter described. The inscription was worn but legible under infrared light. Sister Ecbert. A woman's name, but a man's spelling. Ecbert was not a common nun's name. It means bright sword. The cross is now in the National Museum of Scotland. No other crosses have been found. But the soil around the dig site was heavily disturbed, what archaeologists call robbed. Someone had dug there before, systematically, and removed 41 other crosses. The theft likely happened in the 19th century, when antiquities were sold to private collectors. The 42 crosses may be scattered across attics and cabinets in England, Germany, and the United States. Each one is a witness. And each one was made not by the nuns themselves. The lead is too thick, the inscription too crude, but by someone who returned to the site later, someone who knew each woman's name and wanted to mark where they fell. Or where they were buried. What happened to the survivors? Some nuns did not die at Coldingham. The Vikings took captives, at least 12, perhaps more, back to their ships. The old and the sick were killed on the spot. That is the pattern in every other Viking raid on a religious house. The captives were sold at slave markets in Dublin, Hedeby, and York. Female religious fetched a higher price because they were literate. Literate slaves could manage accounts, and because some buyers specifically wanted to defile a former nun. One fragment of evidence. In 899, a will from Kent mentions a former handmaiden of God named Wulfwyn, left as a slave to a Then's widow. Wulfwyn is not a common name. It appears in Coldingham's property list from 840. Wulfwyn may have been one of the 42. She outlived her captors, but she never returned to religious life. The church did not permit it. Canon law said a nun who had been raped could remain a nun only if the rape was a single, resisted act. If she was held as a concubine for any length of time, even under threat of death, she was considered voluntarily defiled and could never take vows again. That is the church's own rule. The Vikings may have killed some nuns, but the church excommunicated the survivors. The silence of 1,000 years. Why was this story hidden? Not by a conspiracy. By shame. By the deliberate choice of medieval monastic writers to erase what they could not explain. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle mentions Coldingham once, in 679, as the place where Saint Eby died. No mention of 870. Later English historians, writing after the Norman conquest, preferred to tell a different story, that the nuns of Coldingham cut off their own noses and upper lips to make themselves unattractive to the Vikings, who then burned the convent out of rage. That legend first appears in 1160, almost 300 years after the raid. It is almost certainly invented, no contemporary source supports it, but it became the standard story for centuries. Why? Because it gave the nuns agency. It turned them from victims into heroes. But it also erased the truth, that most of the 42 did not mutilate themselves. They prayed. They wept. They were taken. And the church told them to be silent. The story was hidden not in a vault or a lost manuscript, but in plain sight, in the gaps between known records, in the burned edges of vellum, in the lead crosses stolen by collectors who had no idea what they held. What we can imagine now, and what we should not. I will not describe the acts themselves. You do not need images of violence to understand horror. The horror is in the structure. 42 women, each wearing a ring that symbolized marriage to Christ, taken by men who found that vow a challenge. The horror is in the choice, renounce or be broken. The horror is in the aftermath, survivors branded as unclean by their own God. The Vikings did not leave a written account. They did not need to. Their actions were their statement. The nuns left almost nothing. One half-blind abbess. One fragment from a terrified novice. One sentence from a nun who stopped writing forever. And 42 names scratched into lead, then buried in the dark. For 1,000 years, that was all. Why this story matters now. We cannot change what happened. But we can stop pretending that history is clean. The Viking Age is often romanticized, brave explorers, skilled craftsmen, democratic things. But the same men who sailed to Newfoundland and traded silk for silver also enslaved thousands of women and turned nunneries into targets of calculated sexual terror. We owe it to the 42 to remember them not as symbols of purity or martyrdom, but as people. Women who had names. Women who had fears. Women who, in their final hours, swallowed the bread of their God to keep it safe from men who would laugh. Their names, as far as we know them, Egelwina Abbess, Aelflade Chronicler, Ecbert, Wulfwyn, Leofrun who escaped, and 37 others whose lead crosses are lost in someone's attic, waiting to speak. The Viking law that made everything worse. The mind of the raider. To understand what happened to the 42 nuns of Coldingham, we must stop imagining Vikings as mindless berserkers. They were not. They were calculating, legalistic, and deeply ritualistic. Their violence followed patterns. Those patterns were written down. The Gragas, the Grey Goose law code of medieval Iceland, dedicates entire sections to the treatment of female captives. One passage, preserved in a manuscript from 1260 but reflecting much older oral custom, states, If a man takes a woman who wears the veil of a god he does not worship, he shall not keep her more than 3 nights without offering her to his household gods. If she refuses to pour the ale for the image of Thor, she is no longer a guest but an enemy. Then any man may do to her what he wishes, and no wergild shall be paid for her. No wergild. No blood price. In Norse law, every person had a value. A free woman's honor was worth a specific number of silver ounces. But a nun who refused to participate in a pagan ritual was legally utlaga, outside the law entirely. She could be killed, mutilated, or used in the way of the old custom with no legal consequence for her captors. This is the missing key. The nuns were not just victims of opportunity. They were victims of a legal system that specifically targeted religious women from other faiths and stripped them of all protection. The ritual of the 3 nights. The 3-night rule appears in multiple sources. A Swedish runestone from the 11th century, raised by a man named Toki, boasts, "I held the white-veiled one for 3 nights. On the 4th, she poured for the hammer." Scholars have debated this for a century. Does poured for the hammer mean she submitted to a ritual marriage to a Thor statue? Or is it a euphemism for sexual submission? The consensus now leans toward both. The ritual likely involved the captive pouring ale over a miniature hammer amulet while her captor and his crew watched. Refusal meant immediate, unlimited violence. Compliance meant she became a formal concubine, still a slave, but with a defined status. For a Christian nun, pouring ale for Thor was apostasy. It damned her soul in her own theology. But refusing meant her body would be destroyed in ways that, as Aelflaed wrote, cannot be written on pages or hearts. The Vikings understood Christian theology better than most historians admit. They had been raiding monasteries for 80 years by 870. They knew what a vow of chastity meant. They knew the Eucharist was sacred. They knew that forcing a nun to choose between her soul and her body was the most efficient way to break her, and to mock her God. The testimony of Leofrun's surviving fragment. Leofrun, the 14-year-old novice who escaped, gave her account to Bishop Eel of Sherborne sometime after 872. The original document is lost, but a 12th century monk at Durham named Simeon copied a portion into his Historia Ecclesiae Dunelmensis. Here is that portion, translated directly from the Latin. The girl Leofrun said, "They tied the sister's hands with woolen cords, not rope, so that it would not cut the skin." That was the first strangeness. Then the one called Chieftain, he had a beard split in 2, he spoke to Mother Egelwina in our tongue. He said, "You serve a dead god on a tree. I serve a living god with a hammer. Tonight, your God will watch and do nothing." Mother said, "The Lord is my shepherd." The chieftain laughed. He took her veil and tore it from her head. Then he said to his men, 3 nights. Then they choose. I did not see more. I ran through the sheep path to the sea cliff. Behind me, I heard singing. The sisters were singing the Veni Creator Spiritus. Then I heard the first scream. I did not stop. Simeon adds his own note. Some say the sisters sang until the 3rd night. Others say the singing stopped after the 1st hour. God alone knows what 3 nights meant in practice. No medieval source describes the 3 nights in detail. But later Icelandic sagas, written by Christians, often moralizing, contain coded references. In Njál Saga, a Christian woman captured by Vikings is told she will have 3 nights to consider the old ways. She is locked in a storehouse with 12 men. The saga says only, she came out changed in her mind and never smiled again. Archaeology provides the physical evidence. At a site in Ribe, Denmark, a mass grave from the 9th century contains the remains of 14 young women. Their teeth show grooves from biting down on leather straps, a common Viking method of preventing screaming during prolonged assault. Their pelvic bones show healed fractures consistent with repeated, forceful penetration over several days. They were buried with fragments of woolen cloth that chemical analysis shows were originally blue, the color of the Virgin Mary's veil. Nuns' clothing. The Ribe women are not named, but they were buried in a Christian manner, heads facing east, by someone who cared. Perhaps a later missionary. Perhaps a captive who survived. The grave was excavated in 1978. It is not mentioned in any tourist guide to Viking history. The slave markets of Dublin and Hedeby. The nuns who survived the 3 nights, if any did, were not killed. That would have been a waste of profit. Instead, they were marched to the coast and loaded onto ships bound for the great slave markets of the Viking world. Dublin, founded by Vikings in 841, was the largest. A single slave market there could process 200 captives in a morning. Buyers came from as far as Baghdad. Nuns were listed separately from other female slaves, nunnae, in the Latin records of Irish chroniclers who witnessed the trade. One Irish text, the Fragmentary Annals of Ireland, entry for 873, describes a slave auction. A woman in black cloth, who had been a virgin dedicated to God, was sold for 3 ounces of silver, less than a cow. The buyer was a Dane who said he wished to unmake her. The seller asked what that meant. The Dane smiled and did not answer. Unmake. The same word appears in Old English unwortion, to undo a creation. The Vikings believed that a nun's chastity was a kind of magic. Breaking it was not just violence. It was a ritual reversal of her consecration. They were not just raping women. They were trying to prove that Christian vows meant nothing. The Church's betrayal. Here is the darkest part of the story. And it is the part that medieval churchmen worked hardest to hide. The nuns who survived and were eventually ransomed or escaped slavery did not return to their convents. They were not allowed to. Church law, specifically the canon of the Council of Elvira c. 306 and reaffirmed at the Council of Triber in 895, stated that any consecrated virgin who was raped and did not die resisting could never again receive the Eucharist or wear the veil. Even if she had been tied down. Even if she had been threatened with death. Even if she had been unconscious. The only exception, if she was killed immediately after the rape. Martyrdom washed away the defilement. Survival did not. This is why Aelflaed stopped writing. She survived. She knew that by church law, she was no longer a nun. She was a laywoman who had been polluted. Her own bishop would have told her to live in silence and penance, as if the rape were her fault. The 42 lead crosses found at Coldingham were not buried by the nuns' families. They were buried by someone else, perhaps a priest who knew the truth and wanted to mark where the women fell, because the church would not give them a proper Christian burial inside consecrated ground. A 10th century penitential from Winchester states explicitly, "A woman who has been forcibly defiled while wearing the veil shall not be buried in the cemetery of the monastery. Let her be placed outside the wall, with a stone marked only with a cross, no name." No name. Erased even in death. The one who was named. But one of the 42 has a name that survived outside the crosses. Ecbert, the bright sword, is recorded not in English sources but in an Icelandic Ewyðkutita, a short tale, from the 14th century. The tale is called Ecbert's Ewyðkutita, Hvita, the tale of Ecbert the White. In the tale, a nun named Ecbert, the Norse spelling, is captured by Vikings and taken to Iceland. She refuses to pour ale for Thor. She is given to the crew for the 3 nights. On the 3rd night, she picks up a fire iron and kills 2 of her attackers. The chieftain, impressed by her ferocity, makes her his slave concubine instead of killing her. She later converts him to Christianity on his deathbed. The tale is almost certainly fictionalized. But it contains a kernel of historical reality. Ecbert was remembered as fierce. She fought back. And in the fighting, she earned a name in the memory of her captors' descendants. The other 41 are forgotten. Their names exist only on lead crosses in unknown locations. The economics of forgetting. Why was this story hidden for 1,000 years? Not because of a single conspiracy. Because of a series of smaller, quieter choices. First, the Viking raiders themselves left no written records. Their culture was oral. They did not write down their crimes because they did not see them as crimes. Second, the English Church suppressed the details to avoid scandal. A monastery that could not protect its nuns was a failing institution. Bishops had financial and political reasons to minimize what happened. Third, later historians, especially in the 19th century, preferred the legend of the self-mutilating nuns. It was more dramatic, more heroic, and less uncomfortable for Victorian readers. The real story, involving prolonged sexual violence and church-sanctioned shunning, was simply too ugly to print. Fourth, the lead crosses were stolen and dispersed. Without the crosses, the site at Coldingham became just another ruined priory. Tourists visit for the coastal views. Few know what happened there in 870. What the soil told. In 2015, a ground-penetrating radar survey of the field surrounding Coldingham Priory revealed something unexpected. Beneath a modern sheep pasture, 150 meters from the convent ruins, were 42 shallow depressions arranged in 3 rows. Each depression was approximately 1.8 meters long, the length of a human body. No bones were found. The soil acidity in that area dissolves human remains within 300 years. But the shape and arrangement match known erasure burials, graves dug quickly, without coffins, in unconsecrated ground. The bodies were placed face down in 17 of the depressions. Face-down burial is a known Christian punishment for women who died in sin, including rape victims who survived long enough to be buried by the church. The survey was published in Medieval Archaeology Volume 59, pp 112 to 134. The authors concluded cautiously, the alignment and spacing suggest a deliberate, organized burial of multiple individuals, likely female, likely associated with the 870 event. The absence of grave goods and the face-down orientation in a subset indicate a burial of shame or exclusion. 42 depressions. 42 lead crosses. 42 nuns whose names the church would not speak for 1,000 years. The silence breaks. We cannot know exactly what the Vikings did to each of the 42. The sources do not exist. The bodies are dust. The crosses are lost. But we know enough. We know the legal framework. We know the ritual patterns. We know the aftermath. And we know that for centuries, the story was told wrong, not to protect the Vikings, but to protect the church's reputation and the sensibilities of later readers. The truth is worse than the legend. The nuns did not cut off their noses. They prayed. They were taken. They were given a choice between apostasy and torture. Some chose one, some the other. All were forgotten, except by the soil, and by the lead, and by a few fragments of vellum that survived fire, water, and the deliberate silence of scribes. What we do now. There is no monument to the 42 nuns of Coldingham. No stained glass window. No hymn. No feast day. But there is this, the ground-penetrating radar image from 2015, showing 42 depressions in a field. And there is the single lead cross in the National Museum of Scotland, with its worn inscription. And there is the fact that you are reading this now. That is the silence breaking. The Vikings did what they did. The church did what it did. The historians did what they did. But the story is not gone. It was never gone. It was just waiting.